Thank you guys so much for the kind words. Totally surprised this morning by that treat. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, but I feel like when I was a kid, the thing that they did for people's 40th birthday was get them black balloons. It was like the over-the-hill thing. I'm glad no one has done that yet, so that's a win. It's 50 now. Okay, all right, good to know. I have something to look forward to. But I also have to say, if I really haven't aged at all in 6 years of church planting, that is a miracle from God directly. So thank you guys for celebrating me. That means so much. I want to jump into our message this morning. We are continuing the series that Sharon kicked off last week called Life Hacks. We're going to be looking at the book of Proverbs and looking at wisdom that it has for us for some of life's most persistent challenges. How does it help us to solve some of these problems or manage these challenges? Now, not to be too on the nose, but one of the things that I love about the Hebrew word for wisdom is that it can translate to English in to live skillfully or living skillfully. And I love that because it's such a practical picture of what wisdom looks like. And I think when we think of the people in our lives who are wise, that's a pretty good description of what we see, that they live life skillfully. And so this morning we come to the first topic of our Life Hacks series, which is the topic of self-control. And I want to name up front that I think for many of us, maybe in our culture, we're more comfortable with the language of self-discipline and the language of discipline. And I think that there's something to that, but I think self-control is what's under self-discipline. And it has this spiritual connotation to it. And so I'm going to use those somewhat interchangeably this morning. I just wanted to name that up front. But the beginning of the year is a common time to hear people speaking about exercising more self-discipline or self-control. Maybe that's around exercise and exercising more consistently, or maybe it's around financial discipline, or with our diet, exercising more discipline around our diet. Maybe it's around relationships and vowing to date fewer of the wrong people this year, right? Or maybe vowing to get back out there even though we've had some rough goes. Maybe it's being more disciplined about our work-life balance or disciplined about focus on our family. Maybe it's getting more serious about career goals or getting out there and finding a job. Whatever it is for you, the intention is always, it's right, it's strong, right? You feel very strongly that this is something you need to take steps on, but it's the follow-through that's always the hard part. That's the difficult part. And I didn't know about this until this year, but apparently there is a day every year called Quitter's Day. Anybody else familiar with this day? So this day is the day that researchers have found that many people give up on their resolutions. Now, what is shocking about this day is how early in the year it is. January 10th. It's already come and gone. It's done. 10 days in, people are abandoning. But I don't want to just talk about self-control and self-discipline when it comes to setting goals and achieving them. I want to talk about the deeper inner conflicts that we face as we wrestle with our desires. The conflicts in which we feel like we're at war with ourselves day in and day out, and we don't really know what to do about it. Sharon likes to say that I'm a self-disciplined person. That's why she tapped me to preach this message. But what is also true about me is personality-wise, I'm an Enneagram 3, if that means anything to anyone. But what that means is I can fall prey to being preoccupied with image management. And so to be completely honest with you, sometimes my self-control is more about image management than it is anything else. So I just want to own that up front. But what this does to me is this leads me to, sometimes when it comes to making decisions, I twist myself into all kinds of knots, trying to figure out what is the right thing to do. Or maybe what appears to be the right thing to do. Or I twist myself in knots trying to convince myself that what I want to do is the right thing to do. You know what I'm talking about? Where there's that part of you that wants to do something, but you know deep down maybe this isn't the right path to follow. This is especially true for me when it comes to purchasing decisions and decisions around things that we purchase. And I want to tell you a story about this that kind of illustrates this. When one of our children was born, and I'm not going to name them, they will remain unnamed as they sit over here watching me. But when they were born, they operated as if they fell asleep, they would actually die. And so they just never fell asleep. It was an ongoing struggle. There were nights where just hours rocking them in their little rocker and just kind of stewing about like, this is my life now. This is what I'm going to do for the rest of my life. And in this moment, with these frustrations, I had this thought. And I don't know how this became the thought, the solution, but I had this thought in this moment. You know what would fix all of this? If I just traded my car, then I'd be happy. I'd get rid of this piece of junk Honda Civic Hybrid that I think is a death machine, because I would press the gas, and then 10 seconds later, the car was like, oh, you want to go forward? And I came up with all of the reasons why I needed to do this, why this would fix everything, and why I needed to trade this in. But then there was this other part of me that was like, but is it wise financially? Is this the right decision financially? And I thought, well, maybe not, but what is my happiness really worth, And so kind of had this internal battle, and the wiser part of me that's like, Ike, this isn't about the car, right? And desire, on the other hand, is like, but it's not about the car. And I wish I could tell you that the wiser part of me won out, but it did not. Traded cars. Surprise, surprise, it did not fix all of my problems in life. But it kind of illustrates that internal battle in a comical way that many of us are familiar with, where everything in us wants to make this decision, to do this thing, but there's something else in us that says, hold on a second. Maybe we should think about this for a second. The verse from Proverbs that we're going to focus in on is Proverbs 25:28, and it says this: like a city whose walls are broken through is a person who lacks self-control. The image here is obviously that of an ancient city that has walls around it for protection. And the obvious importance of city walls in ancient times was protection. It created this monstrous obstacle for enemies coming into a city. It put them at a severe disadvantage for coming into the city. Isaac and I have been watching a lot of Lord of the Rings lately, and it seems in every one of them there's some city with this massive fortification, this wall around it, and so much of their tools is about how do we get over the wall? How do we get through the wall? And the inference of the verse is clear enough, that a person who does not have self-control is as vulnerable to attack as a city whose walls are broken down. But I think the author's point goes deeper than that. You see, the objective of the wall was to keep the enemy on the outside. But enemies can easily enter into a city whose walls are broken down. And I think the connection with self-control here is that for the one who lacks self-control, the enemy is on the inside. A more literal translation of this passage that I think gets at this is, it goes this way: a city broken down without walls is a man without restraint over his spirit. That we lack control over the spirit in us, our desires, our passions. And sometimes, if I think we're honest with ourselves, the one who is most responsible for our downfalls is ourselves. It's called self-destructive habits for a reason. And yes, there is an enemy who comes at us from the outside, but he is often most effective when he plays on the vulnerabilities that are already inside the camp. Our fears, our passions, our pain, our desires, our thoughts. And so when it comes to this, I think it's important for us to remember and to understand that the complexity of being human means understanding that we don't always know the difference between self-fulfillment and self-destruction. And so we need self-control to help us pursue and determine which is the right or wise path. That sometimes in our seeking for fulfillment, we believe that this is the right path, but it's actually a path to self-destruction. And so we need self-control to help us determine the wise path. I want to take us to a story in the book of Proverbs that paints my personal life hack when it comes to exercising self-control. And Proverbs doesn't have a lot of stories in it. It's mostly proverbs, proverbial statements. But one of the things that we know about the book of Proverbs is that it was written or it was compiled as a collection of wisdom from a father to his son. That King Solomon is compiling this wisdom, depositing this wisdom for his son about how to live life skillfully. And as he does that, he tells him this story, beginning Proverbs chapter 7, verse 6. At the window of my house, I looked through the lattice. I saw among the inexperienced, I noticed among the youths, a young man lacking sense. So he's looking out his window and he is observing this scene that is about to unfold. Crossing the street near her corner, he strolled down the road to her house. At twilight, in the evening, in the dark of night, a woman came to meet him dressed like a prostitute, having a hidden agenda. So we're beginning to see what's going on here, that this is a story of seduction. That this young man is headed to this woman's house, and it's a story of their encounter. And I want you to notice that there's two stories going on here. That there's the story that Solomon is telling his son by telling him this story, but there's also the story that this young man is telling himself about what's happening right now. About what is about to happen, about how fulfilling it's going to be, about how exciting this is going to be. And when we look at this story, I want you to place yourself in this place of understanding that the truth is we are all being seduced by something. That maybe we are blinded by emotions to the things that are seducing us, but maybe we're being seduced by anger. Maybe we're being seduced by self-righteousness. Maybe we're being seduced into reacting more strongly or earlier than necessary or overreacting in some moment to something. But this young man is telling himself a story about how this is going to go. It continues on, verse 13. She grabs him and kisses him. She brazenly says to him, I've made fellowship offerings. Today I've fulfilled my vows. So I came out to meet you, to search for you, and I found you. What is this about these vows? What is this about these offerings? What she's saying is, I've been to the temple. I've made my sacrifices. I've made my offerings. My slate is wiped clean, and I'm ready to dirty it again. And he's telling himself this story of she's coming for me. She came out to find me. She wanted me. Story goes on, I've spread coverings on my bed, richly colored linen from Egypt. I've perfumed my bed with myrrh, aloes, and cinnamon. Come, let's drink deep of lovemaking until morning. Let's feast on each other's love. My husband isn't home. He went on a long journey. He took a bag of silver with him and will come home at the time of the full moon. So this young man is telling himself this story as he's making his way down the street about how amazing this is going to be. And that it's all happening under the cover of darkness, and so no one will ever know. Her husband is gone. No one will ever know. And I've wanted this for so long, and it's finally going to happen. The father is telling his son this story as a story illustrating why self-control is important. But within that story, this young man's story is a temptation story. It's how our temptation stories usually go. What I mean by that is that self-control and temptation usually tell two very different stories. Temptation often tells a very short-term story with best-case scenario. That I'm going to indulge this desire and it's going to be every bit as satisfying as I imagine it will be. And secondly, if there are any consequences, I can handle it. I can manage it. But self-control tells a different story. It tells the long-term, more realistic story. That chances are our expectations are a bit unrealistic. But even if it is every bit as satisfying, it is momentary. And there are most certainly aspects of the story that we are ignoring. And there will certainly be consequences that we cannot anticipate, much less mitigate. And so as the father concludes this story to his son, how this story ends, he says in verse 21, she seduces him with her persistent pleading. She lures him with her flattering talk. He follows her impulsively, like an ox going to the slaughter, like a deer bounding toward a trap, until an arrow pierces its liver. Like a bird darting into a snare, he doesn't know it will cost him his life. The father is trying to paint a picture for his son about how there are consequences to these temptation stories that we cannot anticipate when we only see the temptation story. Years ago, there was a guy who came into my office to talk about something that he had been struggling with. And he was married, he had a couple of children, and he came to my office and he sat down and he said, so there's this person at work, this woman who, she just gets me, she understands me. It's nothing like my relationship with my wife. She knows how to make me feel seen, feel understood, feel admired. We work so well together, and she's beautiful. And he said, sometimes I think if only I was with her, gosh, then I would be happy, and no one would ever have to know. And as I listened to him tell this story, I began to think about how one-dimensional this story is. How this is a one-dimensional narration of reality. And so I turned to him and I said, what is a fuller picture of this scenario? What's a three-dimensional narration of reality? That, all of that may be true. But even with your relationship with your spouse aside, what about the future of your relationship with your children? What's this going to mean for that relationship? What about the future of her relationship with her children? Do you really want to be a part of destroying that? What about how the fact is no one is perfect, and so you are only seeing one side of this person? You don't know their deepest insecurities, their fears, their worries, their pains, their struggles. You don't know how they communicate in marriage when you're frustrated with each other. What makes you so confident that this is the way this story is going to go? My point is that self-control helps us to pause and tell the whole story. Desire often tells a one-dimensional story. All that we can see is how it will address this desire. But self-discipline sees in 3D. And so here is my personal life hack when it comes to self-control. And maybe this is deceptively simple, but I want to encourage you in these moments where you find this war in yourself to place your decisions in their long-term story. To see beyond the one-dimensional story that your desires are telling you. To be honest with yourself that if I take path A and I'm honest with myself, seeing reality in 3D, where will this take me? Where will I be in 3 to 5 years, 10 years, 15 years? Or switch sides. If I take this path, if I'm honest with myself, where will this take me in 3, 5, 10 years? I use the example of an affair because of how easily it depicts the nature of temptation and the ways that our inner desires kind of attach to these external attractors. But this plays out in all kinds of scenarios where our desires prompt actions. But then there's something in us that says, hold on, wait just a second. Let's think about this before we act. Now, I want to be clear, and Sharon touched on this last week, that this isn't just about right and wrong. This can also be about wise and unwise. And sometimes we need to ask the question whether, not that it's a question of am I sinning in this, but is this wise? Maybe it's the question of should I run back to a relationship that I know isn't best for me, but it's better than the pain I'm feeling right now. Is that wise? Financial decisions, maybe not right or wrong, but is it wise? Business decisions, it's not necessarily right or wrong, but is it wise given where I am and where I want to be? So I want to get really practical for a second. How do you place your decisions in the long-term story? Well, the first thing you got to do is be honest with yourself. What's the one-dimensional story that you're telling yourself? What's the glamorous story that you're telling yourself about how all of this is going to go perfectly, nothing's going to go wrong, there aren't going to be any consequences? What's the one-dimensional story that you're telling yourself? And then secondly, what then is the three-dimensional story? What's the fuller picture? Who's going to be affected by this who isn't being considered in the one-dimensional story? What relationship is going to be damaged? What personal values are going to be forfeited? What's the full picture if I let this story play out? And then finally, what's the story that you want to be told? 10, 15 years down the road, looking back on this moment, outside of the emotion of this moment, what story will you wish had been told? One of the tricks I remember being told when I was learning how to drive is that the best way to stay between the lines of your lane is not to look at the lines that are kind of right in front of your car, but to look down the road, and that'll help you stay in your lane. And I think a similar thing is true, that the best way to keep our lives between the lines is to look down the road. What's the story that you want to tell? Now, this message around self-control can become a heavy message because it can begin to feel like I just need to muster up every bit of internal fortitude to be more disciplined. But lest we fall into that false belief, I want to take us back to our scripture reading this morning. Galatians chapter 5, where Paul reminds us that ultimately self-control is a fruit of the Spirit. It is the product of God's transformative work in our lives. And what's true about the fruit of the Spirit is that it is not something where there's this instantaneous effect where if I just say the right words, voila, I will have self-control. The development of the fruit of the Spirit is a much more organic process. When you think about growing fruit, plants of the earth, right? When you're growing that, you're not actually making it grow. What you're doing is you're creating the environment where the growth can happen. You're removing obstacles to the growth. You're providing nutrients so that it can thrive. And so what I'm getting at this morning with this message is to understand that we don't ultimately produce the fruit of self-control, but what I'm advocating for is something that can help create an environment where that fruit can grow, where self-control can flourish, where God's work in our lives through His Spirit can thrive, ways that we can remove obstacles by paying attention to the stories that we are telling ourselves. But if you are here this morning and this message is weighing heavily on you, it just feels like you've tried and tried and tried, and the discipline just isn't there. The control just isn't there. I also want you to know that the good news is that in spite of our bad stories, there is a bigger story that you and I belong to. The story of God's healing, redeeming, forgiving work in the world. And so if you find yourself in that place this morning of just weighed down by this message, our prayer, your prayer, is a simple one. We sang it just a little bit ago. I need you. God, I need you. I can't keep trying to do this on my own. I need you. And so I want to create some space now for us. We're going to have our prayer team come forward and be available. But I just want to invite you to bow your heads for a moment and to make yourself present to the presence of God with us here. And if there's something in your life where it's just, God, I need you, I invite you to cry that out to him, to communicate that to him, to invite him to do this work of producing this self-control in your life. But even more important than that, that maybe if you are in need of forgiveness this morning, to know that his scriptures tell us that if we confess our sins, if we confess our bad stories, he is faithful and just to forgive us. And that our stories can turn a new page today. I want to invite you to just connect with God for a few moments.